NASCAR Cup Series Team Stewart-Haas Racing will cease operation at the end of the year. Officials made that big announcement this afternoon, which will impact the Cup Series garage.
It's official. Stewart-Haas Racing will be shutting down at the end of this season. For anybody who's been following this organization over the last few years, this was an inevitability. Both Tony Stewart and Gene Haas have other interests outside of NASCAR. For Haas, it's his F1 team, a team that has notoriously been one of the worst teams on the grid. And for Stewart, he's had a multitude of other interests. First it was the SRX, which also has shut down recently, and currently it's his drag racing team. Stewart himself is a full-time driver on the drag racing circuit, and he's also a married man looking to start a family. It's been a story at how absent Tony and Gene are from the team, how they're almost never at the racetrack, or even at the shop for that matter. As their interests wane, the performance of the team has also had a sharp decline. Last year, the team went winless in the Cup Series for the first time in their company's history. And so far this year, they've never really been close to winning either. It almost doesn't feel real. SHR was once one of the best teams in the sport, a team that regularly competed for championships, a team that won championships twice with Tony Stewart and Kevin Harvick. But when you look a little closer, Stewart-Haas Racing never quite was one of the elite teams. Sure, Harvick's 4 team was. From 2014 to 2020, they were one of the dominant forces on the Cup Series grid. But everything else just never was at that same level. Ryan Newman in his tenure here was hit or miss. Kurt Busch usually was competitive, winning a race or two every year, but was nothing more than a mere playoff contending team. Eric Almirola managed to grab a few race wins and made the playoffs for several years, but didn't amount to much anything else. Clint Bowyer had one good year here. Chase Briscoe had that random round of 8 appearance. And let's not even really talk about Danica Patrick's tenure. The point I'm making is that SHR was never quite a dominant team, in the same vein as some of the other 4-car operations like Hendrick Motorsports and Joe Gibbs Racing, where any given week, any one of those 4 cars can go out and compete for a win. Those competitive days were few and far between for Stewart-Haas Racing. Compounding the problem was when they switched to Ford as their manufacturer. I'm not going to mince words. The move to Ford was a massive mistake. Take Kevin Harvick out of the equation, because it is very clear that he was the glue that held the entire operation together. Remove him, and Stewart-Haas Racing has only won 8 races since they switched to Ford as their manufacturer. Even more damning is remove the 2018 season, the season that was the best overall year of Stewart-Haas Racing's history, and their win total goes down to just 4 race wins. They never were the top Ford team. It was always Team Penske. And moving on into the next-gen era, RFK Racing leapfrogged them on the Ford totem pole. Speaking of the next-gen era, this organization never adapted to the next-gen car. No team in the sport has been more penalized during the next-gen era than Stewart-Haas Racing. Just off the top of my head, the 4 team got hit with an L2 penalty. The 14 team is the only team with an L3 penalty. Even earlier this year with the roof rail penalties on the 10 and the 41 teams. And there have been a couple other penalties sprinkled in throughout. They never adapted. Other teams have gotten penalties, yes, but usually those have been 1 or maybe 2-time occurrences. For Stewart-Haas Racing, it's been 3, 4, 5 occurrences. And as we go farther along with this race car, Stewart-Haas Racing falls further and further back in the competition. Even last year, before Front Row Motorsports became a Tier 1 Ford partner, they were still probably an overall better organization than Stewart-Haas Racing. Front Row Motorsports. That basically says everything you need to know about the competitiveness of Stewart-Haas Racing. Compounding the problem was the retirements of both Kevin Harvick and Eric Almirola. Like I mentioned, Harvick was the glue that held this entire operation together. He single-handedly carried Stewart-Haas Racing. The vast majority of their wins since switching to Ford was through Harvick, as I've mentioned. But even before then, he is the only driver besides Tony Stewart to have been championship competitive, and he was able to get one in 2014. But despite many more attempts at running for a championship, it never quite materialized, culminating in 2020 with the massive choke at Martinsville. Yes, He should have won that championship. And the championship playoff rules are stupid. I don't like them. But you know what? They are the rules. And Harvick and this 14 completely crapped the bed that weekend at Martinsville. Sadly, that 2020 choke was the last year of Harvick's championship competitive edge. He was still good in the following 3 years, but he was never at that level again, and he only won twice more in the rest of his career. With his retirement, there was no way this team was ever going to be competitive for a championship for years to come. And for Eric Almirola, even though his entire tenure here was never that noteworthy, he brought in great funding with Smithfield. And with his retirement, Smithfield up and left the sport altogether. Losing that sponsorship money was a massive blow, considering that Stewart-Haas Racing has also had other sponsorship issues. They lost Busch Beer with Harvick's retirement to Trackhouse. They lost both Jimmy John's and Subway. They basically lost Mobil 1 to TRD. Sure, they've gained some sponsors like Mahindra Tractors with Chase Briscoe, but that's just nowhere near close enough to be able to fill in the gaps, those massive gaps, I might add, left behind by companies like Busch, Smithfield, and Mobil 1. It certainly doesn't help when Stewart-Haas Racing is also unable to land massive free agents. I'm still befuddled to this day at how Stewart-Haas Racing was never a serious contender for Kyle Busch. Yes, Kyle Busch's competitiveness has gone down over the last few years, but he's still Kyle Busch. He's still the greatest driver in the sport today. And remember back to 2022, we still thought Kyle Busch could still be a vast improvement and a major help to an organization for their competitiveness. Having Kyle Busch on any organization would have been a huge get. Stewart-Haas Racing would have been a great landing place, and it made a lot of sense considering that he had KBM with him at the time. That right there was a damning statement in of itself. But the big one that everyone thinks of was when Ford denied Tony Stewart the opportunity to sign Kyle Larson. Even before Larson's incident that spring, Stewart-Haas Racing was looked at as one of, if not the top landing spot for him. And while it would have been a hard sell after his incident, Kyle Larson still has so much raw talent that any team would be lucky to get him. But Ford decided to prioritize their bottom line, and I think that was the major catalyst for Tony Stewart to be completely disenfranchised by Ford. And with all of these other circumstances swirling around that I've laid out, it's no wonder that this team is going under. Now, I don't exactly blame Gene Haas or Tony Stewart for having other interests. Life happens, people change, interests change over time. What I have a problem with was stringing along this organization and its downward spiral into mediocrity for years. If they weren't truly committed, then they should have sold off this team long ago, or at least part of the team. Go down to a 1 or 2 car organization that would have been much more manageable. And I get it, they have contract obligations. But regardless, it's just sad to see 1/9 of the competitive field in the NASCAR Cup Series to just continue to circle the drain and really add nothing of value in the sport. But now it's over. There will be teams buying these charters. There will be teams signing these drivers who are committed to being as competitive as possible. And overall, the NASCAR Cup Series field will be better for it. But that's a sad commentary in of itself, that the NASCAR Cup Series field will be better without Tony Stewart. And I think that's what hurts the most. Tony Stewart was one of the superstar drivers of NASCAR's boom period. One of the greatest NASCAR drivers of all time. Hell, one of the greatest race car drivers of all time. Who was so incredibly versatile that he could jump into any car and be competitive in it. The fact that the NASCAR Cup Series will be better without his race team in it is just so sad. Hopefully everyone who was employed by SHR will be able to land on their feet and find great opportunities. But the sad thing is, when a team totally sells off like this, there will be some people who will never recover. There will be some people who will never find that landing spot. And my heart truly goes out to them. Even if this is the better long-term move, in the short term, this is a very sad and very disappointing day in NASCAR. Rest in peace, Stewart-Haas Racing.